All right, thanks, Greg. Thanks for inviting me up to give a presentation today on the groundwater model. So two components here. We'll talk about the model, and then we'll talk about some of the Schedule 5 standards and how they might change in this update that we're working on. So yeah, just looking at the time here, so I've got the dreaded late afternoon time slot. And it's just to Alan. I guess, Alan, you always seem to end up in this time slot historically, so this is a passing of the torch. Take one for the team, all right. So let's talk about the model. So as part of this presentation, I think it's always good, I'll just burn through some early stuff here, but it's always good just to go back and talk about what this model is. And so just hopefully by the end of this presentation, we'll be able to answer some of these questions, you know, like what is this thing, and what do we use it for, where does it come from, look like, and then we can talk about some of the changes that we're working on. So what is it? Well, you know, how is this thing set up? Well, it's a model. So we're talking we try to simplify things. We've got some physical processes, chemical processes, attenuation processes, transport processes, fate. So we're trying to lump in a bunch of items and into a model. But what we want to put forward here is that this is a simplification, approximation. So it is just a model. So we've got a spreadsheet set up with this, and we've got a couple components, and they're all linked together. And essentially, at the end of the day, we're going to calculate soil standards that are deemed protective of water uses. So what does this thing actually look like? So if you've gone, when you go to our website, or when you have gone to our website and you've gone to Guidance Documents, Technical Guidance 13, and you've downloaded the file, well, this is what you would get. I know some of you have done that, and you can't run it. There's a couple of issues with Excel and previous versions, but so this is what when we talk about the model, BC Environment Model, BC Transport Model, Groundwater Protection Model, Soil Standards Model, this is what we're talking about. I'll come back to that a bit later. So what is it, what does it consist of? So essentially we've got four processes. Starting from the top, this slide actually comes back from 1995. Those of you who were on that initial working group, workshop that worked on this model way back when might remember this slide. Essentially, we've got some kind of precipitation, rain, snow, coming through the surface. We'll get to some kind of source of contamination. So we're going to get some leaching. So we've got downward migration of leachate down to the water table. Once we hit the water table, I've got some mixing. And then once it's mixed, then we've got some transport to a receptor. So if we're here for the receptor, you just see there's a pipe sticking in the ground. This is a water well. So conceptually, a little bit more updated figure. Still working on this one. You can see some funny stuff there with the water table and the receiving environment, the lake. But anyway, same idea. So some precipitation. Hitting the soil, leachate, migration, mixing, transport, receptors. So water can be used for what? Irrigation, livestock watering, water well, or get to aquatic receiving environment. So we're trying to get that black stuff. What is the concentration in soil? So to repeat, we want to calculate soil standards, protective of groundwater, specific use. Where do we find this stuff? Well, these are what's showing up in Schedule 5 for all the water use pathways. So we know in Sched 6 we've got 4 water uses. Heather's gone through those. Glenn's talked about it. You guys all know those. So when you look at Sched 5, these are the pathways we're talking about. Glenn talked about tox earlier, is worms and lettuce. Intake from a human health perspective. So we're using the model. We're calculating standards for these 4 pathways. So what else do we use this model for? Everyone knows we can do site-specific soil standards. So we've got a default scenario set up in the model. And you can use Protocol 2, and you can modify some of those defaults. So based on your site-specific conditions. This then leads to site-specific soil standards, which can be used as part of a numerical certificate application, numerical instrument. So it's not risk-based, so Protocol 2 is numerical-based. The other option here is we use some similar components from the model. We use that in P13, screening level risk assessment, and that is P13 is a risk-based approach, although standards AP can do it. So we've got a model, but we use it in different places. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later, what we're trying to achieve with that, with this updating. Okay, where does this come from? Well, it comes back, Glenn talked about this is 1995 generation, the model in its current formulation. So initially, as part of the first stakeholder workshops, initially it was just kind of put together for organic substances, non-polar organics. And then there was some feedback, well, maybe, let's expand this a bit. It could have been ministry driven to expand it a bit, but regardless, we added on a few ionizing organics and then added on inorganics as well. So at the time, it was like 16 substances. Over the years, expanded to 22. And then you can see the substances there. What's in red? These are in SCED 5 as a matrix, but we actually don't calculate a water use. We don't calculate a soil standard for a water use pathway for those substances because they're deemed just insoluble. So initial framework put together by Golder, put a bunch of spreadsheets together, and then we had a fellow in-house who took those and created that front-end interface to the model, and so we're back to this one again. This is what it currently looks like. So you can see we've got the source, item 1, leachate migration 2, mixing at the water table 3, transport item 4, and we've got, you got to see our substance up there. You can see you can pick your water use standards. If you take the default, that's populated. You can put in your own as well. You can turn that off and put in your own water use standards. So you could use this model right now to generate standards. You could also use it if you have, if there's a current water quality guideline that differs from what's in SCED 6. You could use the model right now. You could use that water quality guideline, stick it in the model and generate soil standards, and that would be a risk-based approach. But anyway, that's what it looks like right now. So where are we going? Well, okay, so here's kind of the next iteration, next version, and you'll see it's it's quite a bit busier. Some similar elements there, but essentially we're trying to be a bit more transparent. We're trying to get, one of the comments that we heard before was it's hard to figure out where numbers came from. How did you calculate this? What did you use for that? So we put pretty well everything on the interface sheet. So it's probably too much, but at least you can see where it all is. So this is kind of a direction we're going in. You can see some of the options that we have here. We've got a default function. Defaults are built in. You can select those, or you can turn them off and put in other properties when you're doing site-specific soil standards. You can see a little toggle box to the left. We've got SSS and SLRA. So one of the components here was because there's similar components to both these tools, then we wanted to add some functionality. So ideally, we're working towards you can be able to use this under SLRA as well, because SLRA has that transport component, so you'd be able to use this model to calculate that transport component in P13. So that's just the toggle there, toggle on between site-specific and SLRA. Okay, so that's kind of what it looks like, and that'll be coming out. That won't be coming out in July, but that'll be coming out later, because as part of this whole process of putting out what our changes may look like, proposed changes, we're looking for that feedback, and that may result in some model changes. So we may be tweaking the model or maybe making changes to the model, although there isn't much time for that, but I will throw that out. So why are we doing changes? Glenn's had quite a bit of time on this, so we're trying to, this one component, always the overarching goal is to update it to current science. And we've got these other products. We've got SLRA, I mentioned, we've got P2. So we also then want to harmonize between these two, between the products that we have. And then we know there's also CCME uses a model. We know other jurisdictions use groundwater model. So if we can harmonize with those agencies as well, let's try to achieve that. And then we want to make this thing more user-friendly, transparent. This will be both for the model interface, the actual model that you use, and then also all the supporting documentation. So where are we going with this model? What are the changes? What might they look like? So far what we've done is we've gone through the model, had a look at it, done some updating already, and so we are going to make some changes. So these are largely based on what we got from SAB. So if you remember the SAB's report, this was going back to 2005 now. So they had a bunch of recommendations on the model. So we've kind of used that as our starting point, and at the same time kind of filled in a bit with a little bit of literature review on other jurisdictions, but we weren't able to get too far with that just based on time that we have for this project. So that's kind of a more detailed review is kind of as a future consideration. But let's kind of talk about some of the changes. So one of the things that we heard from SAB back in their report was that, you know what, we kind of like your framework with those 4 components we talked about. You know, we've got the source zone, so we're going to have some partitioning from the source zone. We generate a leachate. We've got the unsaturated zone transport, mixing, saturated zone transport to the receptor. They thought, you know, that's a pretty good framework. So you guys, we recommend that you stay with that. So okay, well, we've adopted that. We're sticking with that. But you know, in the course of your review of this, when this comes out, this white paper, you know, feel free to add comments on this. If you think, you know, is this current formulation of this model, is this reasonable for what you see in BC? So currently it's set up for the Fraser River sediments and Lower Mainland here. Is that a good representation for all of BC? Look forward to some comments on that. Here's this slide again. Okay. So we know changes, we want to calculate new standards. So Glenn talked about Schedule X. So Schedule X, we're going to be adding new substances. So you can think of, remember Glenn's spreadsheet? I should have loaded it from yours. But think about, he had that green column, then he had the yellow column. Okay, so everything that was a yellow, if that comes in the greens, then essentially all of those will, if they calculate a tox, worms and lettuce, or intake, then we'll also calculate a pathway standard for those. So looking at the inorganics from that list that Glenn had put forward, those are some of the inorganics that may come in. So antimony, beryllium, boron, cobalt, cyanide, uranium, vanadium. On the organic side, you know, because one of our goals is kind of harmonization between all our products. So if we look at SLRA, SCED 11, SLRA took substances from SCED 11, and there's 150 substances in SCED 11. If we look to SCED 10, there's all drinking water standards for many of those substances. So theoretically, we could bring in about 150 substances that we can calculate at least a DW pathway for. Think about that one for a bit. You could get a lot of schedules, a lot of matrices. Anyway, that's on the books. So what do we know about other changes? So when we look at, I guess the most obvious one is that we know that there are, since standards came out initially and the minor updates that have been done ongoing here, we know that there's been updates to the Canada Drinking Water Quality Guidelines, or BC Water Quality Guidelines, CCME. So this is just some of the ones that we're aware of, and there's probably more that's going to come out of this process. But say, for example, we look at some of these substances, and the arrows just mean kind of which way soil standards may go if we were to adopt these standards, these guidelines. So we know for benzene, if we look, currently benzene is 4,000 for AW fresh, and BC Water Quality Guidelines, it's 400. So it's a factor of 10. So I think you can all pretty well figure it out. If we drop the receptor concentration by a factor of 10, well then we know our soil standard has to decrease. Same thing with toluene. We know we have a current water quality guideline is 5. It's currently 390. So soil standards would go down. Okay. Toluene, AW marine, there is no, well, okay, so right now there is a standard, but there is no water quality guideline anymore, so that could be one that's gone. So you can see direction of some of these. So copper, lead, the only difference there with those is that currently there is no AW marine. way back when there was no distinction, fresh, marine, in the original model. So that's one, sorry, I forgot to mention that. That's another functionality that will be added to the model. So copper and lead, we're just basically taking the fresh value. So now if we actually, there are actually marine concentrations. So if we put those in, well, actually they're lower than the fresh. So those standards would go down. CAD. Okay, there's an up. So if we took the CAD value, I think that when I looked at the guidance document, it was 0.5 to 3.6, so that could be an up. Chrome, down. PC, I have to check that, Heather. I think in your slide you had. Anyway, I'm thinking there's no standard there for that, but for PCE, but it could go to 30. Same with PCP, it could increase. So this just gives some kind of rough idea of maybe directions in some of the soil standards by adopting current guidelines. So one of the other options that we had on the table was, well, maybe we need to modify our soil type. Maybe this isn't fully representative of BC, or it's too conservative as a whole. So one of the things that we looked at was, well, you know, what do other jurisdictions have? We looked at CCME. They've got a coarse-grained soil type. And, well, you know, maybe if we modified our soil type, we could make a slight, if we did modify it slightly, we'd end up with a slightly slower groundwater velocity. And if we did that, then that's, you know, for a substance that decays, you know, you're going to get more attenuation. So in that case, soil standards would go up a bit. So this is just a comparison of what our current soil standard, Fraser River sediments, and say we compare it to looking at what the CCME values are. So if we kind of went more direct, if we took a direction that was more similar to CCME, we'd maybe not those exact soil properties, but something similar. So you can see the difference in velocity there. Okay, the other thing we got from SAB was for these inorganics in SCED 5, let's standardize. Let's go with EPA, KDs. Okay, so if we did that, then we know for most substances, for a number of substances it won't change. For some it would. KD values would change. So then absorption, depending on how much absorption you have for the substance, the standard could go up or down. So we know if we took CAD values from EPA, depending on the pH range, they could either go up or down. Same with zinc. So currently we have, EPA doesn't have KD values for copper and lead, so that's something we would generate. And then we have our own in-house KDs that were developed internally for these other substances that were added post-1996 for barium chloride, mercury sodium. So those would just stay the same. So what would, you know, looking at that CAD plot, taking the EPA values versus our CIS, you can see the pH range there. So, you know, if you're lower pH, you get quite a bit more absorption using the EPA KD isotherm. That would mean higher standards. At a higher pH, that would be slightly lower. Same with zinc. Could be lower again at higher pH values. Okay, what are the other changes we want to do is for inorganics. Okay, so, you know, it's difficult to model inorganics, right? You know, besides fractured bedrock, they're probably the most complicated trying to model the fate and transport of inorganic substances. So what else can we do? Well, we do, you know, in P2, site-specific soil standards has a leachate method. It says, you know, you can use a leachate method to figure out how much could leach from soil. Instead of using the numerical standard in CSR, you could do a leach test, and that forms the basis of your soil standard. So that's great, except we haven't actually prescribed what leaching tests to do. So this is so this doesn't actually affect, you know, matrix standards right now in CSR, but this is a functionality that we want to get in place with P2. So I throw this out just as this will come in the second batch looking for comments, because as we update all these documents, we have to update P2. So in this, we would prescribe a leachate test, but we'd be looking for any kind of feedback on what do practitioners think is a reasonable test to use. So right now in P13, we use the SPLP and the T-clip, depending on the pH of the soil. So we could adopt that approach, or we could adopt one leachate test, or we could use a completely alternate leachate test. We could go with the MEP, multiple extraction procedure, which is a rather aggressive T-clip analysis. So that would probably be the most conservative. So this is kind of on the table for updating in P2. I just throw it out now. It would be good to get some feedback on this as part of this model review. So that's coming down the pipe. Other recommendation that came forward was let's, for our saturated transport component, let's go with a steady state formulation. Most of the standards right now are at steady state concentrations. So our current travel time in the model, we use a transient formulation. Right now it's a travel time of 2,200 years. So most substances are at steady state. A few aren't. So the SAB recommendation was, well, you're pretty well steady state anyway. Why don't you just go with a steady state formulation equation? Okay. So that's on the table. But what this means, if we went in this direction, most substances are steady state, but not all. So like cad, copper, lead, zinc, those aren't at steady state. So if we went steady state, those would drop. Fair bit for some of them. At the same time we were working on SLRA, we had a look at that, and you'll notice that there aren't very many biodegradation rates in P13. So we know that we needed to update that. So we led a contract to get some updated decay values for substances, for organics. This was done by AGM. So this is, back in 2011. It's been sitting on our books for a while, but this is something that we would put out for stakeholder comment as part of the white paper review. And so they did a fairly detailed review of current literature and came back with some recommended rates for biodegradation. And they're actually a little bit, if we look at it on a half-life basis, they're actually a little bit longer than our current values that we use. So if we took this approach, then these values would mean there's less decay. So our soil standards would drop. Another thing we looked at, SAB recommendation was, and we see this with quite a few sites that we have, is chlorinated organics, chlorinated solvents. We see that with PC and TC, it just doesn't degrade on the subsurface. So we have lots of sites where we don't see decay. So currently in the CIS model, that's another name for the groundwater model. So in the model we have decay rates, so we allow decay for these substances. But the recommendation on the table is, well, actually quite often we don't see decay, so we shouldn't actually have this in our generic standards. So we would exclude decay for these substances. That would be a change. So if you exclude decay, your soil standards would drop. Then few other changes in the books is, one of the overarching objectives is we don't want to generate NAPL with soil standards. So one way to deal with that is to try to limit solubility. So we could impose a limitation on solubility of a substance, so some measure of some constraint on the solubility. So in this case, we're putting forward let's restrict solubility by 50% for LNAPL, DNAPL organic substances. And this just reflects, what we see with, typically you don't find a single substance in the subsurface. It's typically present as a mixture in most cases. So this is just a conservative measure to account for that. And then there's a bunch of small other changes to the model that we're looking at is, the slightly revised mixing equation. Doesn't make much of a difference, but there's a slight change in the dilution factor. Kind of try to do some alignment with CCME, modify our source term, 10 meters instead of 5 meters, so small changes like that. Standardize all our database values, go with the RACE database, Department of Energy, stateside. So this wouldn't just be with the model that would use this. This is kind of all our protocols that we use. Just try to standardize where we select the data from, the database data values. SAB recommended updating the PCP isotherm. Okay. We talked about modifying the soil type. We would just do that with all the other parameters in, make that consistent. And then there was some minor stuff, background adjustment. There's some little bit of funny stuff that happens in the model with that. And rounding rule was on the table. I think that's off the table again. But and then documentation. Right now, it's kind of hard to find stuff. Right now, it's, I think, largely in help files in the model, or it's way back in the original derivation document. So some people actually haven't seen how we derive some of this stuff. So we'd update that. And then, as I mentioned, update P2, update P13. That's changes that we have so far. So we look forward to comments on what we put forward in our white. There's a few other issues in the white paper, but we'll look forward to your comments once this comes out in July. And any questions? Guy?
My experience with modeling from many, many years ago, I don't know if it now, was that using a model was always pretty critical to have validated the model with real-world data, real-world experiment. And I don't get the impression that this was ever validated. Was it?
Well, there was initial work done back in the initial modeling stages, trying to model it to Fraser River sand scenario, some of the sites that were on the books at that time. So there was some, Rob may be able to.
Hello. Fairly limited because our timeline was shorter than what you have. And for all of them, it was especially for the organics, it worked out quite well. So it's very high level of it. I don't know where the documentation went though.
If you could mine your records, Rob.
It's in my little black books that are in my garage, I think.
You know, and this other jurisdictions have adopted the similar model framework. So CCME has gone in this direction. Alberta's using the same formulation. Ontario's tweaked it a bit, but you know, that's so far we haven't done any additional validation of the model. Although we quite often get that question, and we quite often think about that, is, you know, what do we see in groundwater?
20 years.
Yeah. It is just a model. Martin?
George, I was wondering if you ever foresee a day then, if the P2 is ever finalized and you give leachate, you know, how we can do these things, that we could actually do that for a certificate, use P2, set our own soil standards, if it's an AW exceedance or something, right? And we use leachate, and not have to go to the ministry for an approval? Is that ever going to?
For sure. Okay. For sure. That's it's one of the objectives here for updating model. So updating P2, make P2 a bit more user friendly, because there are some, we've had stakeholder comment, there are some difficulties in using P2. So P2 isn't used very much right now. We'd like to see that expanded, so that is a component of this update as well.
What we normally end up doing is go to SLRA and use that method anyway.
Yeah. So, I mean, you could come forward currently under P2 requesting, you know, I'd like to use this leachate test. That's and it's true.
Hello?
Cindy?
Do you see a day, which would be a nice day, where you can use your actual groundwater data to show that there is no, like a DW exceedance, like you have a soil, for example, benzene for drinking water is 0.04. Can you foresee a day where we can exclude that line because we got actual groundwater data at our site that shows it does not exceed drinking water for benzene, and therefore you can go for a numeric certificate rather than having to bring that through to a risk assessment, because we can do that in our detailed risk assessments.
Right. Can I see a day when we can do that? It's you know, it's something on the books for consideration, is looking at that as part of P13. You know, is there a way of doing that where we can say that, you know, the groundwater data trumps, in effect would trump the soil data? So something that we're looking at. I can't say at this point that we would actually adopt that, but we have had the question before, and it's something that we'll look at as part of updating P13 in this process. So when you see the next version of P13, then that'll be the place to look for it. Well, never say never, right? I mean, it is under consideration. Gary?
Yeah, I have an additional comment about the previous question and your answer. I believe that as long as there's still source, contaminant source in the soil or groundwater, there's still a contamination, transportation, right? The process is still there. So you don't see it in groundwater today doesn't mean that you will not see it tomorrow or 5, 10 years from now. So I think we still need a model to demonstrate that in the next 500 years, for example, it will not reach the receptor. I also have another question, where the ministry also developed the model for the constituents of concern that has a chain reaction, like a PCB, chlorinated phenols, something like that. Yeah, which have the daughter products.
Okay, PCE, TCE? Yeah,
Chlorinated phenols.
right. So those are currently in SCED 5. The proposal is to remove the decay for those substances, just not allow decay for those substances. So they would remain as matrix standards, substances as in the matrix standards, just that they wouldn't have a decay value. So you'd still calculate a soil standard, but it'd be more conservative than what there is right now. So is that the question, Gary? Or? Yeah. Okay.
Just wonder if we can demonstrate that actually there's a biodegradation process in place.
Yeah.
Is there any flexibility
Yeah.
to use certain biodegradation grade?
Yeah. Right. Okay. So that's something that we would then look at as, what is there? How can we build that into the process? Okay. So we wouldn't do it may not be able to do that for the generic standards, but is there a way of it's either site specific or, it's always possible screening, a risk-based approach. But is there a way of doing that perhaps under site specific? So it's something we can look at. All right. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, George. So thanks to Glenn's team there, Glenn and Heather and George, for going through all that with us. It's great to know what's coming, even though we don't really know exactly how it's going to affect us, but I guess the one constant is change, so at least we know that much. All right, so Carrie and Kelly, are we just you? Okay, all right, well, thanks.
I figured it was 5 minutes, I can handle it.
All right, great.
So, hi, I'm Kelly. That's Carrie. There's a lot of confusion with that. I'm going to just really quickly, obviously in 5 minutes, give you a quick summary of where we're at with these discussion papers and where we're going with them. Before I do that though, I have good news announcements as far as site profiles go. The management team got together last week and was talking about the current requirement to get pre-approvals for not delineating contamination on particular sites, flow-through sites and things like that, that are described, the different scenarios in Admin Guidance 15. And they've decided that we're not going to require you to get a pre-approval for those sites, for site profile releases anymore. So that's good news. There will be technical expectations similar to P6 submissions. So we're going to be updating all the documents. In the meantime, if you're submitting a site profile release where you have one of these sites, I would really appreciate it if you basically submitted all of the information that you would as you would for a P6 submission, so that we can still look at it and review it and make sure it makes sense. I don't have to search all over the place or ask you for more information. Just have a separate section in the release request explaining why you don't need to delineate and include all of the necessary information. But you don't have to do a separate pre-approval before you submit your release request. So hopefully that makes sense. Anyway, moving on. So back last fall, we posted 2 discussion papers, one on soil relocation and one on site profiles for public comment. The comment period closed February the 2nd, and we received over 20 submissions for each paper. There was a fairly good cross-section of comments received from local government, industry, consultants. So it was really nice to see all of the participation. We also had a few webinars and face-to-face meetings, and we had all of those comments recorded as well. So we got a lot of information through that process. Our contractor has compiled all of the comments into 2 documents. The first one is a compilation of everything that we obtained through the webinars, all the face-to-face meetings, and the written submissions. And it's broken down into different stakeholder groups, so it's kind of nice to see it laid out that way. And then if you want a shorter read and just to get a general gist of what everybody was thinking, there's a summary of the public comments, and it just lays out the trends for each section of the document, what people agreed with, didn't agree with, liked, didn't like, that kind of thing. These 2 documents are supposed to be posted on our website for you to view at some point. We don't really know when yet. It's in the process of getting approved, right? Have you heard anything? Sometime it will get posted, and we'll probably send out a CSE link so that you know that it's there and where to find it on our new website. Just the overall impressions, really briefly. For both of the documents, there was a general consensus that they're important and that we should continue to have them in some form, but that acknowledgement from everyone that they were really complicated and really hard to make everybody happy. Local government versus developers versus consultants, and all the different stakeholders kind of have their own opinion of how these things should run. So it is difficult to figure out a different path forward. Specifically for site profiles, it was clear everybody liked the fact that it was linked to local government permits. To the degree that's done was a little bit maybe not so much agreement. But there was definitely a desire for clarity, consistency, and flexibility to be maintained with whatever changes we do make. And for soil relocation, everybody wants to see some sort of notification process so that the ministry is still involved in some degree for the appropriate types of soil. So the ministry still has some oversight in soil that's moving around the province. And so the next steps are Carrie and I are reviewing the comments that we've received. We're going to be doing some jurisdictional review to see what other places are doing for these 2 topics. We may or may not have some working groups if we get stuck on certain points while we're trying to figure out where to go next. And all of that will be rolled into an intentions paper that the intention is to be completed in the summer. I'm just going to stick with that. And then again, the papers, when they're ready, hopefully in the fall of this year, will be posted again for another round of public comment. And we'll probably run some webinars again, possibly another face-to-face if we think it's worthwhile. And then that's our contact information. So if you want to give us some comments about soil relocation, it's Carrie, and the site profiles is me. That's it. Did it take 5 minutes even? Okay. All right, any comments, questions? Nothing? All right, perfect.
All right, thanks a lot, Kelly. Thanks for the update. Thanks for keeping it quick. Sorry you're only given 5 minutes, but not sure how that worked out. Anyways, all right, so our final speaker for the day, Mike McFarland. Looking forward to your discussion about new initiatives.
New initiatives. So as usual, we got way too much work on the go and stretched thin and FTEs, but that's nothing new. So every couple months, I give you the current org chart. So this is the post-Dave Lockhart era. So the empty space down on the bottom there between Jennifer and Ardith, that's Dave's box, no more. There is no plan to fill it. We now have several new staff on with us. So John Ward retired January 7th, enjoyed his time in Southeast Asia. Sent me nasty pictures of him having a good time in Hawaii. Dave Lockhart likewise sent me a picture of himself kicked back in his jacuzzi hot tub with a glass of wine and a cigar. So he's enjoying retirement. So we've, with John's departure, we hired Danielle Gerbovich, who joins us now as the manager of operations, and will be departing in September on maternity leave. So we'll be rotating the position in that chair again for a little while. Jesse Givner left to work at Forest Natural Land, or FLNRO, Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations. That position, we hope, is going into the postings this week. So maybe get somebody in to help out in the legislative front, by August or so. We also stole from regional operations using Dave's box, Jennifer Pajallo. So some of you may have dealt with her from regional operations. So Jennifer joins us. We also have a co-op student working for us, Rosanna Bridle. So she takes over from Russell, but she's doing very different work than Russell. I'll speak to the work that she's doing as part of the work plan that we have. Okay, so stats, as usual, it was a busy year. Lots of bits and pieces by all the staff. So we're still really busy with site profiles. That is part of the impetus behind trying to streamline that process so we can build a bit of capacity there. Lots of IR sites. So one of those things as well, if you remember the business model government talked about, is busy on the front end, busy on the back end, get out of the middle. So from back end compliance thing, where would we be looking at in the future to maybe look at? Probably going out and looking at IR sites as they come up. Still a lot of notices of offsite migration. This remains a long-term discussion point with our regional operations because a number of these come from permitted sites. 41 new sites identified as high risk, 10 reclassified. 189 legal instruments issued, 143 through CSAP. So, it just speaks to the work that you guys are doing and how important it is. And then our revenues. Nice thing that we heard yesterday, or 2 days ago, was confirmation that our revenues actually come back into our program area as opposed to they're just going to general revenue. That was good news to hear. So government priorities. So the ministry has a service plan that's on the ministry's webpage, and a couple of the areas that how these interface. So the government jobs plan is a key piece, and they relate to a lot of the files that you're working on. So some of them are the properties being repurposed. So wood fiber is a classic example where, former industrial site is a mill being repurposed for LNG. So we have a number of other related LNG projects that are coming along and mine-related projects. So when we're dealing with those, it's not just you guys that are screaming at us. We've got like the LNG ministry screaming at us of where it is. And how many times I received calls from the deputy minister going, we don't have the submission yet. I can't pre-approve something. I know there's a deal coming down. Or the other one would be in Aboriginal Affairs. We've got a treaty negotiation piece in play. Well, I can't predetermine that, this has been signed off because it hasn't arrived yet. So those are the pressures that we hear as well. Compliance and verification. So maybe some of you don't know that we actually have days where we do this. We down-tooled a couple months ago where it was like, put aside everything else, we're going to do groundwater reviews. So all these monitoring reports, it was basically clear the deck, that's our focus. It's also looking at, did they meet their timeline? Is there anything that shows up in site that somebody failed to make a submission on time? So we're looking at those. We have the policy and legislation pieces just to keep going through. CSAP, the continual reliance on this thing, building on it, continuous improvement, looking at more work coming to you guys, particularly in the light of some of the work that we're looking at, right? We'll try to lean on some of those pressure valves where we can refer some high-risk sites to APs to deal with so that we can build some internal capacity for other priorities. Brownfields 2.0 strategy. So we're now the lead on brownfields, so we're working on a strategy that we have to take to the minister and to cabinet. Likewise, residential underground storage tanks. I tried to keep this out of our program area and put it into one of the other branches of the division, but it landed with us. But again, it's the reality. There's a lot of those out there. I can't remember the total numbers for estimated in BC, but in Saanich alone, they're looking at potentially 8,000, right? These are homeowners. It was never really the intent of the CSR to deal with these things, but it's a consequence of these things leaking, right? And people are going broke. Just got an email today about somebody wanting to meet with the minister because they're going to be bankrupt in a couple of weeks. We'll have to sell their house. We'll have to dip into whatever other assets they have to pay for their site. And then we're busy dealing with the CSR standards updating. So for brownfields, one of the things we want to look at is look at the Brownfield Strategy 1.0, lessons learned. What are the opportunities that we can take from what worked and what can we improve upon? Right, increasing the role of some of the key stakeholder groups in local governments, right? That's the connection between us as the regulator, a potential contaminated site that's being up for redevelopment, and the local government's economic development engine, right? What are the priorities within them? What's going to make the big win for them locally? Working with some of the landowners and developers, look at business cases for some of those. So we talked before about a business case for the CSAP and what you do. It was interesting with the minister getting very attuned to being one to look at a brownfield strategy. The US EPA released the outcome of the last 5 years of US injection into the brownfield strategy in the US. So it was a big piece for the economic revitalization by Obama, was put money in for brownfields revitalization. So Brownfield Strategy 1.0 was looking at an economic return on investment of about $4.5 for every dollar invested. In the US, they saw $17.1 return on investment in 5 years for every dollar invested by the federal government. So there's a good development thing. They cleaned up ridiculous number of sites, created 90,000 jobs in a 5-year window. So we start looking at those, it makes sense. It is a driver in small communities, right, where there isn't necessarily the big industries. It's not Vancouver with a big casino. Revitalizing a couple of corner gas stations into a mixed use can have a real impact to them. So the thing we'll look at is we're now the lead on it, so that we took that over from Flinro, our sister ministry. We still continue to participate as much as we can in meetings with other ministries and local governments to talk about brownfields and specific projects. We're looking at reacquiring the assets from Flinro so that we can have those available on our webpage so people can find out the other groups, what's available in other jurisdictions, models to look at, the gas station toolkit that was developed as part of that. And a big piece that we're also looking at is reassessing the role of the Land Remediation Fund that was brought forward in Bill 13 in 2004. Residential USTs, so just some stats. So a lot of people, including myself, probably had an older house that had a UST. Typically, houses from the 30s to the early 60s, depending on where you lived. Used to be covered by your insurance policy. So the Insurance Bureau, for the business of making money, not really insurance, they looked at what their potential liabilities were. And they had looked at it based on a couple of case studies or a number of case studies to look at what the average costs for an insurance claim would be. And these are just give you an idea of, for $1.2 billion in premiums, they potentially had a $4.5 billion liability exposure. They're in it for making money, so you don't have insurance that covers these except unless you can prove it's a historic claim before the policy's changed. So you're no longer covered by your insurance. It's an ongoing liability for probably the next 10 to 30 years, depending on where you live in the province and what alternate fuel was brought to your availability to substitute for oil. So we're undertaking, and this is Rosanna's project, as a jurisdictional review of programs for underground storage tanks, with a recommendation to us of what is needed in the province. Will it be regulation that's needed? Do we need to look at model bylaws? Do we need to look at registration of tanks? Do we need to certify the people doing work? And for CSAP, you can look at that. One of the big complaints that we get from homeowners is unlicensed or perceived unlicensed practitioners dealing with residential UST pulls and the cleanup, and what we hear about the fairy dust being sprinkled around to make it disappear, or the using the Radio Shack, metal detector instead of ground penetrating radar. So, and again, one of the things that we'll look at, what's the role of the Land Remediation Fund from 2004? Because it had 3 uses: residential USTs, commercial USTs, brownfield sites, and orphan sites. All right. So we posted 12 documents as well as the discussion papers. So what we're looking at is the feedback that we've received from all the stakeholders. There's a lot of it that's editorial, a few that maybe require a bit more consultation on. So we'll try to batch the two into those that are almost business ready to go out to finalize and those that may require a bit more work. Update those and repost them and finalize them. Same with the discussion papers, as Kelly talked about. Case files. So again, our focus on high-risk sites, and the new wrinkle we have to look at is the political media. When there's lots of sites that sort of hit the political waves and they're on the news or they're on the paper, we get them all of a sudden as a priority to deal with, even if it's not high risk. Ordered sites or pending ordered sites. So we've drafted a number of draft orders and sent to parties, hoping we don't have to necessarily finalize them, but we will if we have to. Those are a priority for us for dealing with. Orphan site declaration. So we just did an orphan site declaration last month. Amara's working on that for us. They just secured the site and are on dealing with that. So that's going to take a bunch of our time to deal with. Based on the Lake Cowichan, the last orphan site that we dealt with, it's an FTE draw. It's probably going to take about 0.6 of an FTE to manage that thing through to completion. And then we'll get into the litigation part of it. Non-compliance issues and audits. So if we're looking at audits, one of the things that we talked about, we're seeing slightly fewer high-risk sites coming into us. We got all this other work to do. But as a model, if we're seeing slightly fewer high-risk sites, do we start moving staff around to doing some slightly different type of work than they do? Brownfields, as we go forward, will probably require people working on that as well. But instrument compliance. CSAP targeted audits. We've got one on the go, I think, right now. CSAP shadow audits. CSAP submissions pulled for random audit to see if it actually is fully complete. Right, and the discussion may be thinking about is maybe it won't impact your client, but will it impact you as a practitioner? If we see chronic issues going through and not being dealt with that aren't being picked up in the PA, do we look to take action or recommend action? So we can build some capacity potentially to do that. Auditing site profile releases. So you promise to do something, your client promised to do it, do they actually follow up with it by the time it comes full circle? And same thing, site inspections. You know, do we have capacity and do we get money to go out and actually look at sites? And that's that whole bit of getting out of the middle and checking at the back end. We have regional operations linkages. So one of the other big pressures we're getting is we have risk assessment expertise, we have hydrogeology expertise, all right, soil scientists and technicians, technologists. So one of the things that we're getting dragged into is to provide technical assistance on applications that our regional operations folks are dealing with associated with specific permits. So we're already involved with LNG. We're already involved with mining, so Elk Valley, which Beth is kindly working on now. We have staff working on that. It's not our permit. We're also working on Mount Poly for technical assistance. So one of the things that I take from our function when I talk to regional operations folks is where they have those similar niches. And I know for Mount Poly, all the firms that are doing work at Mount Poly all have APs. So one of the things that we said to them is, why are we fielding phone calls from field people staff in the field asking which standard applies to this situation out at Mount Poly? Their AP in their own firm could tell them which standards apply. So it takes the load off us having to deal with that, and we can be dealing with something else. Cobble Hill. So if you live on Vancouver Island, you've probably seen it in the news all over the place. Soil treatment facility to relocate contaminated soil for treatment. Cowichan Valley doesn't want it. The local residents don't want it. They're trying to find every way to get out from under it and have it amended. We were out in the field a couple of weeks ago doing more soil sampling around that. So 9 staff out all the lead up time for building that. And again, it's a regional operations file that we're being asked to assist on. We just got a request today to review a stack of reports associated with another facility up in Campbell River. So we're not just dealing with this stuff routinely, we're constantly being drawn into these other high political priorities. So in terms of just from our program area, we have, despite the number of boxes, there's a number of positions that are part-time. We have about 27.6 FTEs. This is just sort of the anticipated breakdown in terms of how we apportion the staff to work on it. The biggest chunk of the FTE's time is towards your case file reviews, then processing the CSAP submissions. The second biggest one that we're looking at for aggregate for the year is updating those standards. Right, so that's a big chunk of time, and to build capacity for that, yeah, we'll be a little bit slower. We're going to push some stuff to, it's a high-risk site, but CSAP process it with our permission so that we have some capacity to do the standards updating. And that's it. So any questions? Guy.
How do you see the role of CSAP changing in the future as far as that goes?
Well, like I said, it was this, as we discussed, I think down the road, I think we could see some group of APs, like the council, potentially signing off some of those instruments. But again, it's going to be make sure it's well vested that they're doing it the same way ministry staff do for continuity and business certainty processes. I think you'll be doing more high-risk sites. I think what you've done right now in terms of the updates on the checklists, where your document could replace one of our protocols or guidance documents, we'll see more of that where we go, yeah, this is a knowledgeable group. We shouldn't have to generate everything. And I know earlier discussion is why isn't government developing some of these procedures or policies? They're not developed in a vacuum, right? And you guys have got that collective experience. That's why you're here, right? That's why we rely on you guys, is to basically leverage as much of that so it becomes much more of that partnership of what we do. You know, we're hoping, because we're environmental emergencies and land remediation, the big push with the land remediation fund, if we go back out and talk about that and our fees go back into that thing, there's the ability, do we actually grow capacity over time? Right? Do we get actually able to argue that there's a lot of work here? It's a cost recovery type of model that maybe the program needs more FTEs to do some of that work, but it's not costing government. It's basically funded by the users of the system. All right. So that, you know, as we build that, that's one of the things. But I think you guys moving more into that ability to sign off on instruments, speak on behalf of some of those policies, develop some of the policies, I think that's going to be there. Priority setting as well. All right. Yeah. Some of it is driven by us politically, but from you guys, the feedback on what we need to change because it's not working or it's a big gap, I think that'll be a role where you guys can step in as well. I think we're in it for the long haul. And the reason we're doing the standards is Dr. Fox, you know, John's retired. Glenn's, I think, next on the list as potential retire, and Dave's retired. So Glenn's the next one that's eligible to retire. We got to start this process, and it's ambitious. We're trying to get things done for that May next year. But again, it's the minister can sign off on standards. We don't have to go to the legislature on them. But we got to start the process to understand it. If I start it after Glenn retires, we don't take advantage of the knowledge that he has and the experience. So we got to get going on this and build some momentum on it. So that's why we're trying to do it right now. And then we'll see who else goes after that. Any other questions? I think it's time for a bureau.
I wonder if you could expand on that.
Well, so if you look at it in terms of, you guys are dealing with a lot of the sites and the processes. So we know there's roughly 20 submissions a month that we deal with that come through this process. But IR sites, there's a large number of them that never come into the fold. So if you wanted to look at it and go of the total amount of work that's going on out in the market, it's one of those areas that's maybe not a lot of guidance related to, but it's an area, if you want to check on compliance, looking at that to make sure everybody's doing it and everybody being notified and you got the appropriate authorizations in place. My fear is how many times you go, they're doing remediation, they don't have the permits if you got a discharge, right? Dave Lockhart went out to look at one last year out in Souk, they were doing work, and they didn't even know there was a reg that they had to comply with. So there is a big vacuum depending on where you go in the province. So, you know, for us, it may make sense to do a little bit of spot checking on some of those. Anybody else? I think it's time for a beer.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Mike, and thank you to all the ministry who shared all their information with us today. It was a lot of information today, long day one way or another. We covered off all the business we needed to this morning, so thanks again to CSAP, Anna, Nellie, and Catherine for setting everything up today. Ran pretty smoothly. We're pretty much bang on time, so that's pretty good. And yeah, there's a no-host happy hour. So get someone else to buy you a beer, I guess is the theory there. At the St. Regis Pub, 602 Dunsmuir. So there's the map. Hope to see you there. Thanks.